Colorado Territory, 1875. The snow swirled like angry ghosts around the small cabin nestled in the shadow of the towering Rockies. Xavier Caldwell pulled his collar higher against the bitter December wind as he urged his exhausted horse forward. The 26-year-old cowboy had spent 3 grueling days tracking down strays from his small herd before the blizzard hit, and now all he wanted was the warmth of his cabin and solitude. Solitude was what kept a man alive out here. Xavier had learned that lesson painfully 2 years ago when outlaws had raided the ranch where he'd worked alongside men he considered brothers. He alone had survived by pure chance, having ridden out early that morning to mend a distant fence line. The massacre had taught him that attachments were dangerous. People you cared about became weaknesses others could exploit. The frontier demanded strength, and strength meant standing alone. His cabin came into view through the curtain of snow, a simple structure he'd built with his own hands after purchasing this small plot of land. It wasn't much, but it was his, and more importantly, it was isolated. The nearest town, Silver Creek, was a good half-day's ride, which suited Xavier perfectly. He expected nothing but the howling wind to greet him. Which is why the thin ribbon of smoke rising from his chimney stopped him cold. Xavier drew the Colt revolver from his hip holster, his body tensing as he approached cautiously. Someone had broken into his home, perhaps outlaws seeking shelter from the storm, or maybe the Blackwell gang that had been terrorizing homesteads across the territory. Either way, they'd chosen the wrong cabin. He dismounted silently, tethered his horse behind a stand of pines, and crept toward the window. The golden glow of lamplight spilled onto the snow. Peering through the frost-edged glass, Xavier's breath caught in his throat. A young woman stood at his stove, stirring something in his cast iron pot. Her dress was simple but well-made, a deep blue calico that complemented her slender figure. Rich brown hair was pulled back in a loose braid that fell to the middle of her back. She moved with a strange familiarity around his cabin, as though she'd cooked in this very spot 100 times before. Confusion replaced Xavier's anger. She wasn't rummaging through his possessions or looking for valuables. Instead, she appeared completely at home. The woman turned slightly, revealing a profile with delicate features and full lips. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old. Xavier pushed open the door, revolver still raised, and the woman spun around, dropping the wooden spoon with a clatter. Her eyes widened, they were green as spring grass, and her hand flew to her throat. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, keeping the gun steady despite his surprise. She stared at him, not with fear but with an expression he couldn't place, something between shock and recognition. "I'm Emma Hayes," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the gun pointed at her, "and I believe you must be Mr. Caldwell." "How do you know my name?" Xavier kept the Colt aimed at her heart, though something about her calm demeanor unsettled him more than any show of fear would have. "Your name is on the deed to this property." She gestured to his desk where his papers lay undisturbed. "I haven't touched anything except to make soup. You have excellent provisions for winter, though you're nearly out of coffee." Xavier blinked, momentarily thrown by her casual observation. "You still haven't explained what you're doing in my home." Emma Hayes took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and looked him directly in the eyes. "I was traveling from Denver to my uncle's home in Silver Creek when our stagecoach was caught in the storm. The driver lost control on the ridge above, and the coach overturned. I was the only one who managed to walk away." Her voice faltered slightly. "The driver and the other passenger, they didn't survive the fall." Despite his suspicion, Xavier lowered his gun slightly. "The North Ridge, that's 5 miles from here." "I followed the creek," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. Now that he looked closer, he noticed her dress was still damp at the hem, and there was a darkening bruise on her left cheek. "I was nearly frozen when I found this cabin. I'm sorry for the intrusion, but it was this or death in the snow." Xavier holstered his weapon, though his distrust remained. "The storm's too bad to travel now. You can stay until morning, then I'll take you to Silver Creek." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell." Xavier moved past her to hang his coat and hat. As he did, he caught her scent, something floral beneath the wood smoke. It stirred something in him he thought had died with his friends at the ranch. He pushed the feeling down, hard. "There's only one bed," he said gruffly. "You take it, I'll sleep by the fire." Emma turned back to the stove. "The soup is nearly ready. You must be hungry after being out in this weather." Xavier watched as she moved confidently around his small kitchen space. reaching for bowls and spoons without having to search for them. She knew exactly where everything was kept, as if she had been there before. "Have we met?" he asked abruptly. She paused, a strange expression crossing her face before she shook her head. "No, Mr. Caldwell. I'm certain I would remember meeting you." Yet as she ladled the steaming soup into bowls, her hands moved with the same certainty she'd shown with everything else in his cabin. It was uncanny, like watching someone return to a childhood home after many years away. "How did you know where I keep my dishes?" he pressed. Emma stilled, her back to him. I simply looked until I found them." It was a reasonable explanation, yet something about it rang false. Xavier decided to let it go for now. The storm was worsening outside, rattling the window panes, and they were stuck together until it passed. As they ate in silence, Xavier found himself studying her. Her mannerisms were refined, suggesting an education that most frontier women lacked. The dress, though simple, was of good quality. What was someone like her doing traveling alone to Silver Creek? "Your uncle," Xavier said, breaking the silence. "Who is he?" "Judge Thomas Hayes," she replied. "He's the circuit judge for this territory." Xavier nodded slowly. He'd heard of Judge Hayes, a fair man by most accounts, but unforgiving of lawbreakers. "And why are you joining him now, as winter sets in?" Emma set down her spoon, her eyes dropping to the table. "My parents died 3 months ago. Influenza. There's no one else." The raw pain in her voice struck something in Xavier that he'd kept buried. He knew that pain intimately, the hollow ache of being the one left behind. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. She looked up, those green eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Thank you." Later, after insisting Emma take his bed while he made a pallet near the fire, Xavier lay awake listening to the howling wind. Something about this woman nagged at him, the way she moved through his cabin with such familiarity, the way she looked at him sometimes, as though seeing someone she recognized but couldn't quite place. It was unsettling. Yet even more unsettling was how her presence had immediately altered the feel of the cabin. For 2 years, these 4 walls had been merely shelter, a place to keep his supplies and escape the elements. Now, with the scent of soup still lingering and her quiet breathing from the other side of the room, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like a home. Xavier turned restlessly on his bedroll, pushing away the thought. Attachment was weakness. When morning came, he'd take her to Silver Creek and return to his solitude. That was safer. That was what he knew, but as sleep finally claimed him, Xavier couldn't shake the image of Emma Hayes moving through his cabin as if she had been there before. Morning brought clarity in the form of brilliant sunshine reflecting off fresh snow. The storm had passed, leaving a pristine white landscape that sparkled like diamond dust. Xavier rose early, stoking the fire before Emma awoke. When she emerged from behind the privacy screen he'd rigged the night before, her hair was neatly braided and her blue dress smoothed as best she could manage after her ordeal. She'd washed her face in the basin, and without the dirt and exhaustion of the previous evening, Xavier was struck by her beauty, not the painted, showy kind found in saloon girls, but something more natural and compelling. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," she said, offering a small smile. "Xavier," he found himself saying, "if we're going to be traveling together, you might as well use my name." Her smile widened slightly. "Xavier, then." "And I'm Emma." They shared a simple breakfast of biscuits and coffee. Xavier explained that they'd need to leave soon to reach Silver Creek before nightfall, accounting for the slow going through the fresh snow. Emma nodded, but as she helped clean up the breakfast dishes, her movements seemed reluctant, almost wistful. "Is something wrong?" Xavier asked as she lingered by the window, looking out at the mountains. "No," she said quickly, then hesitated. "It's just, this place feels peaceful. I haven't felt that way in some time." Xavier understood more than he cared to admit. His cabin represented safety, isolation, yes, but also protection from a world that had taken everything from him. That Emma could sense that same peace disturbed him somehow. They prepared to leave, Xavier packing provisions for the journey and retrieving Emma's small traveling bag that she'd managed to carry from the stagecoach wreck. As she put on her coat, a wool garment that had thankfully dried overnight by the fire, she paused by his bookshelf, running her fingers gently over the spines. "You have a copy of the Odyssey," she remarked, touching the worn leather binding. "It was my father's favorite. He used to read it aloud on winter evenings." Xavier stiffened. The book had belonged to his mother, one of the few possessions he'd kept after her passing. You like Homer. I prefer Tennyson, she said absently, moving to the next shelf where indeed, a slim volume of Tennyson's poetry sat nestled between practical manuals on animal husbandry and gunsmithing. The hair on Xavier's neck stood up. He kept his books organized by author, not by subject. There was no way she could have known where to find Tennyson unless she'd thoroughly explored his shelves, which he doubted she'd had time to do since arriving half-frozen the previous evening. Before he could question her, Emma had moved away, gathering her things with that same uncanny familiarity. It was as though she knew exactly which floorboard would creak, which drawer was prone to sticking. The ride to Silver Creek would take most of the day. Xavier helped Emma onto his horse before mounting behind her, acutely aware of her closeness as she settled against him. Her scent, he realized now it was lavender, mingled with the crisp winter air. They rode in silence for the first hour, following the snow-covered trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen. Emma sat straight in the saddle, seemingly comfortable with horseback despite her refined mannerisms. Another mystery about this woman who had appeared so suddenly in his life. "Were you raised in the East?" Xavier finally asked, breaking the silence. Emma nodded. "Boston, originally. My father was a professor at Harvard before he decided to move us west. He believed in the promise of these territories." "And what do you believe in, Miss Hayes?" She was quiet for so long that Xavier thought she might not answer. "Second chances," she said finally, her voice almost lost in the winter air. "I believe people deserve second chances." Something in her tone made Xavier think she wasn't speaking in generalities. Before he could press further, a movement in the trees ahead caught his attention. He pulled the horse to a stop, instinctively reaching for his revolver. 3 riders emerged from the forest, blocking their path. The men were rough-looking, their clothes dirty and their expressions hard beneath unkempt beards. The leader, a tall man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, smiled without warmth. "Well now, what have we here?" he drawled, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. "Pretty lady out for a ride with her beau." Xavier felt Emma tense against him. "We're just passing through," he said evenly. "Headed to Silver Creek." "Silver Creek, is it?" The scarred man exchanged glances with his companions. "Ain't that a coincidence? We just came from there. Folks weren't too hospitable, were they, boys?" The other men snickered, and Xavier's stomach tightened. "The Blackwell gang, they'd raided Silver Creek. That's a mighty fine horse," the leader continued, eyeing Xavier's chestnut gelding, "and an even finer woman. Maybe you'd be willing to part with one or both." Xavier's hand tightened on his revolver. 3 against 1 with Emma to protect. The odds weren't good. "I'm afraid not," Xavier replied, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Now if you'll excuse us." The scarred man's hand moved to his gun. "I don't think you understand the situation, friend. We ain't asking." What happened next occurred so quickly that Xavier barely had time to register it. Emma's hand shot out from beneath her coat, revealing a small derringer that she must have been carrying in a hidden pocket. The gun was aimed steadily at the leader's chest. "I believe my companion was clear," she said, her voice steel beneath silk. "We're passing through. Unless you want to explain to Marshal Williams why you're bleeding out in the snow, I suggest you move aside." The 3 men froze, clearly not expecting resistance from the woman. Xavier used their moment of surprise to draw his own weapon, cocking the hammer with a decisive click. The leader's eyes narrowed, calculating the risk. Finally, he gave a short laugh. "Feisty one, ain't she? Fine, pass on through. But watch your backs, the territory's dangerous these days." He jerked his head, and the 3 riders moved to the side of the trail, allowing Xavier and Emma to continue. Xavier kept his revolver drawn as they rode past, feeling the outlaws' eyes burning into their backs long after they'd disappeared from view. When they were well clear, Xavier finally spoke, unable to keep the incredulity from his voice. "Where did you get that derringer?" "It was my mother's," Emma replied, tucking the small gun back into her hidden pocket. She insisted a woman traveling alone should always have protection. "And how did you know Marshal Williams' name?" "He's only been in Silver Creek for 6 months. Emma hesitated, her body tensing slightly against his. "My uncle mentioned him in his letters." It was a plausible explanation, yet something about it didn't ring true. Judge Hayes would certainly correspond with law enforcement in his jurisdiction, but for Emma to invoke the marshal's name so confidently, it felt rehearsed somehow. You handled yourself well back there, Xavier said, changing tack. Most women would have screamed or fainted. A small, sad smile touched Emma's lips, though Xavier couldn't see it from his position behind her. I've learned that showing fear rarely helps a situation. The trail narrowed as they began to climb a ridge, forcing them to proceed single file through the deep snow. Xavier's thoughts churned as they rode. Emma Hayes was not what she seemed. Her refined manners and education were real enough, but there was a steel beneath her gentle exterior that spoke of experiences beyond a sheltered life in Boston. And then there was the uncanny way she'd moved through his cabin, finding things without searching, knowing the contents of his bookshelves. By midday, they stopped to rest the horse and eat a simple meal of jerky and hardtack by a frozen stream. Emma sat on a fallen log, her green eyes taking in the snow-covered landscape with quiet appreciation. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "I've never seen mountains like these." Xavier studied her profile. "I thought you said you were traveling to your uncle in Silver Creek. These are the same mountains you would have seen from the stagecoach." Emma's gaze remained fixed on the distance. "Yes, of course, but in the storm everything was obscured. This is my first clear view." Again her answer made logical sense, yet Xavier couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. He decided to test her. "Silver Creek's changed quite a bit since Judge Hayes settled there," he said casually. "The new church on Pine Street is particularly fine." Emma nodded absently. "Yes, Reverend Miller is quite proud of it. The stained glass window was imported all the way from St. Louis." Xavier stiffened. There was no church on Pine Street. Reverend Miller was indeed the town's preacher, but services were still held in a converted storefront while funds were being raised for a proper church building. Emma seemed to realize her mistake immediately. Her eyes widened slightly, and she looked away, busying herself with repacking their food. "We should continue if we want to reach town before dark," she said quickly. Xavier caught her arm as she rose. "How did you know about Reverend Miller? You've never been to Silver Creek before." The color drained from Emma's face. For a moment he thought she might lie again, but instead she sank back onto the log, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I can't explain it," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "Not in any way that would make sense." "Try me," Xavier said, sitting beside her, unwilling to let this go. Emma took a deep breath, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "What if I told you that I recognized your cabin because I've seen it before, not just seen it, lived in it? What if I told you that I know every creaking floorboard, every book on your shelf, every drawer that sticks in the dresser because—" She faltered, then forced herself to continue. "Because in another life it was my home too." Xavier stared at her, wondering if the young woman was touched in the head, yet her eyes, when she raised them to meet his, were clear and intelligent. "You're talking nonsense," he said flatly. "I know how it sounds," she admitted, "but ever since I was a child I've had dreams, vivid ones of places I've never been, people I've never met." She gestured to the mountains around them. "Of this place. Of a cabin by a creek with a crooked chimney. Of books arranged by author on wooden shelves that a man built by hand." Xavier felt cold that had nothing to do with the winter air. His chimney did lean slightly, a flaw in his construction that he'd never bothered to fix, and he had indeed built the bookshelves himself during his first winter on the property. "When the stagecoach crashed," Emma continued, her voice low, "I wasn't following the creek by chance. I knew exactly where to go, even in the blizzard. I knew your cabin would be there, though I'd never physically seen it before. And when I stepped inside," she shook her head in wonder, "it was like coming home." Xavier stood abruptly, needing distance from her and these impossible claims. "You're not making any sense." "I know," she said simply. "I've stopped trying to understand it myself. But I need to get to Silver Creek. Judge Hayes is really my uncle, that part is true, and my parents did die 3 months ago. Everything I told you about my life is true, except you claim to have impossible knowledge of places you've never been," Xavier finished, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. Emma nodded, her eyes pleading for understanding he couldn't give. "I don't expect you to believe me, I just couldn't keep lying to you." Xavier ran a hand through his hair in frustration. The rational part of him wanted to dismiss her story as the ravings of a disturbed mind, yet how else could he explain her intimate knowledge of his cabin, the way she'd known exactly where to find things without searching? The confident way she'd mentioned Silver Creek landmarks that shouldn't have been familiar to her. "We need to reach town before dark," he said finally, unwilling to pursue this madness any further. "Let's go." The remainder of their journey passed in uneasy silence. Emma made no further attempt to explain herself, and Xavier was too unsettled by her claims to engage in conversation. By late afternoon, they crested the final hill that overlooked Silver Creek, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley, with thin columns of smoke rising from chimneys into the clear winter sky. As they approached the town, Xavier noticed unusual activity. Men with rifles stood guard at the main street entrance, and several buildings showed signs of recent damage: broken windows, splintered doors. The Blackwell gang had indeed left their mark. They were stopped at the edge of town by two grim-faced men with shotguns. "State your business," the older of the two demanded, eyeing them suspiciously. "I'm bringing Miss Hayes to Judge Hayes," Xavier explained. "She's his niece." The man's posture relaxed slightly. "The judge mentioned you might be arriving," he said to Emma. "He's been worried sick since hearing about the stagecoach accident." "You're lucky to be alive, miss." Emma nodded. "Could you direct us to his home? I'm eager to see my uncle." "Of course, it's the white house at the end of Main Street with the blue shutters." The man stepped aside to let them pass. "Be careful around town. We had some trouble with the Blackwell gang 2 days ago. Marshal Williams drove them off, but everyone's still on edge." Xavier guided his horse down the main street, noting the damage to the general store and saloon. Townspeople watched them pass with wary expressions that softened somewhat when they recognized Emma as the judge's expected niece. The house at the end of Main Street was modest but well-maintained, with a small front yard enclosed by a white picket fence. As they approached, the front door opened, and an elderly man with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard emerged, his face lighting up at the sight of Emma. "Emma, thank God!" Judge Hayes hurried down the path, reaching up to help his niece dismount. "When we heard about the accident, I feared the worst." Emma embraced her uncle tightly. "I'm fine, Uncle Thomas. Mr. Caldwell found me and brought me safely to town." The judge turned to Xavier, genuine gratitude in his weathered face. "I can't thank you enough, sir. Please come inside. You must be exhausted from your journey." Xavier hesitated, glancing at Emma. After her strange revelations, he was eager to put distance between them. Yet something in her eyes, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper he couldn't name, made him reconsider. "Thank you, Judge, just for a short while." Inside, Judge Hayes' housekeeper fussed over Emma, insisting she change into dry clothes and sit by the fire while she prepared tea. Xavier found himself in the judge's study, a warm, book-lined room that reminded him vaguely of his father's library back east, before the war had taken everything. "I understand from Marshal Williams that the Blackwell gang paid Silver Creek a visit," Xavier said as the judge poured 2 glasses of whiskey. Hayes nodded grimly. 2 days ago. "They robbed the bank and shot the teller. Poor Johnson will live, but he's badly wounded. The marshal organized a posse, but they lost the gang's trail in the foothills." He handed Xavier a glass. "We've been on high alert since then. Most folks believe they'll be back." Xavier thought of their encounter on the trail. "They're still in the area. We ran into them about 10 miles east of here." The judge's eyes sharpened. "Did they threaten you?" "They tried," Xavier admitted. "Your niece," she handled herself remarkably well. A smile touched Hayes' lips. "Emma has always been more capable than she appears. Her father, my brother, raised her to be independent." His expression sobered. "Their loss has been hard on her. I'm grateful she'll be here with me now." Emma joined them shortly, having changed into a simple green dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Her damp hair had been combed and rebraided, falling in a thick rope down her back. The housekeeper, Mrs. Finley, brought a tray of tea and sandwiches, fussing over Emma like a mother hen. Xavier observed the easy affection between Emma and her uncle, noting how naturally she fit into this household despite claiming never to have visited before. More mysteries about this perplexing woman. As evening approached, Xavier rose to leave. Despite the judge's invitation to stay the night, he was determined to return to his cabin. Emma walked him to the door while her uncle spoke with Mrs. Finley about dinner arrangements. "Thank you for bringing me safely to Silver Creek," Emma said softly, her hands clasped before her, "and for not thinking me completely mad after what I told you." Xavier studied her face in the fading light. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was a gravity to her, a depth that drew him despite his determination to remain detached. "I still don't understand," he admitted. "What you described isn't possible." "I know," a sad smile touched her lips. "Yet here we are." An impulse seized him, reckless and entirely unlike his careful nature of the past 2 years. "The town's holding a Christmas social next week. Would you consider attending with me?" The invitation surprised them both. Emma's eyes widened briefly before warm pleasure spread across her features. "I would be honored," she said. As Xavier rode back toward his cabin in the gathering dusk, he questioned his sanity. Emma Hayes had upended his carefully constructed isolation in less than 24 hours. Her impossible claims should have sent him running in the opposite direction. Instead, he'd invited her to the Christmas social, his first voluntary social engagement since the massacre. What was it about her that broke through his defenses so easily? Was it merely her beauty, or something deeper, the strange familiarity she claimed to feel for his life, his home? Despite his skepticism, Xavier couldn't deny that something inexplicable connected them. As his cabin came into view, Xavier was struck by how empty it suddenly seemed. One day with Emma Hayes, and already his sanctuary felt incomplete without her presence. The week leading up to the Christmas social passed slowly for Xavier. He found himself riding into Silver Creek more often than necessary, inventing reasons to visit the general store or the blacksmith when his real purpose was the hope of glimpsing Emma. Twice he succeeded, seeing her from a distance as she helped the town's women prepare decorations for the social, her laughter carrying on the winter air. On his third visit, he encountered Judge Hayes outside the general store. The older man greeted him warmly. "Mr. Caldwell, I was hoping to speak with you. Emma mentioned you'd invited her to the social." Xavier nodded, suddenly feeling like a schoolboy caught passing notes. "If that meets with your approval, sir." The judge smiled, the expression softening his stern features. "Of course, Emma speaks highly of you. In fact, she's spoken of little else since her arrival." His expression grew more serious. "I should mention that Emma has been through a great deal in recent months. Her parents' deaths affected her deeply." "I understand, sir." Hayes studied him thoughtfully. "Do you?" Emma has always been different. Even as a child, she had an unusual perception about people and places. My brother once told me she described in perfect detail a summer house our family owned in Vermont, though she'd never visited it. He shook his head. "Some might call it imagination, others something more mysterious. Whatever it is, it's part of who she is." Xavier stared at the judge, processing this unexpected confirmation of Emma's claims. "She told me something similar about my cabin, that she recognized it without ever having seen it before." "And what did you make of that?" Hayes asked, his gaze penetrating. "I thought she was confused after her ordeal," Xavier admitted, "or perhaps not entirely well." The judge chuckled. "Emma is one of the most level-headed people I know. If she says she recognized your cabin, I'd wager there's truth to it, however inexplicable." He clapped Xavier on the shoulder. "Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, son. Just experienced." As Xavier rode back to his cabin that evening, the judge's words echoed in his mind. Could he accept Emma's strange connection to his home without understanding it? More importantly, could he open himself to the possibility that their meeting wasn't mere chance? The night of the social arrived crisp and clear, with stars glittering above Silver Creek like diamond dust. The town hall had been transformed with pine boughs, red ribbons, and dozens of candles that filled the space with warm golden light. A small band played cheerful tunes while townspeople in their finest clothes danced and laughed, momentarily forgetting the threat of the Blackwell gang. Xavier arrived early, uncomfortable in his seldom-worn suit, his dark hair neatly combed and his face freshly shaved. He stood awkwardly near the refreshment table, wondering if he'd made a mistake in coming, when the door opened and Emma entered on her uncle's arm. She wore a gown of deep emerald green that complemented her eyes and skin tone perfectly. Her brown hair was arranged in an elegant twist, with soft tendrils framing her face. She looked like she belonged in a Boston ballroom rather than a frontier town social, yet her smile as she greeted townspeople was genuine and warm. When her eyes found Xavier across the room, something passed between them, a recognition that transcended their brief acquaintance. She excused herself from her uncle and made her way toward him, accepting greetings from townspeople as she passed. "You came," she said when she reached him, her voice warm with pleasure. I invited you, remember, Xavier replied, finding himself smiling despite his nervousness. Yes, but I half expected you to change your mind. Emma's gaze was frank. You've been avoiding me since we arrived in town. Xavier couldn't deny it. I needed time to think. And have you reached any conclusions? She tilted her head slightly, studying him. Before he could answer, the band struck up a waltz, and Xavier found himself offering his hand. Would you dance with me, Miss Hayes? Emma placed her gloved hand in his. I thought you'd never ask, Mr. Caldwell. As Xavier led her onto the dance floor, he was acutely aware of curious glances from the townspeople. Xavier Caldwell, the reclusive rancher who barely spoke 2 words to anyone, dancing with Judge Hayes' beautiful niece. It would be the talk of Silver Creek for weeks, yet as they began to move in time to the music, Xavier found he didn't care. Emma fit perfectly in his arms, following his lead with natural grace. They moved together as if they'd danced 100 times before. You dance well for a cowboy, Emma observed, her eyes sparkling with amusement. My mother insisted on lessons, Xavier admitted. She had aspirations for me to be a gentleman, despite my father's determination to make me a rancher. And which did you prefer? Xavier considered the question, neither at first. Then both in their own way. The East has its refinements, but out here, he glanced around the simple town hall, decorated with love rather than luxury. Out here, a man is judged by his actions, not his name or connections. Is that why you came west? Emma asked. To be judged on your own merits. Xavier spun her gently before replying. I came west because there was nothing left for me in the East after the war. My parents were gone, our estate sold to pay debts. The frontier offered a fresh start. Yet you live alone miles from town, Emma observed. That's more than a fresh start, that's isolation. The music carried them to the far corner of the dance floor, away from most of the other dancers. Xavier found himself speaking more openly than he had in years. 2 years ago, I worked at the Double R Ranch. There were 6 of us, good men, like brothers to me. One morning I rode out early to check fence lines. The memory tightened his throat. When I returned, they were all dead, shot by a gang that wanted the ranch's horses. I was spared only by chance. Emma's hand tightened on his shoulder. I'm so sorry, Xavier. After that, I decided it was safer to be alone. No connections means no vulnerabilities. Emma studied his face, her expression thoughtful, a logical conclusion. But a lonely one. The waltz ended, but neither of them moved to separate. Around them, other couples began a new dance, but Xavier led Emma toward the doors that opened onto a small porch. The December night was cold, their breath forming small clouds in the air. Town sounds, music, laughter, the occasional whinny of a tethered horse created a gentle backdrop to their conversation. Your uncle told me you've always had unusual perceptions, Xavier said, turning to face her, that even as a child you knew things you shouldn't have been able to know. Emma nodded, not surprised that her uncle had spoken of this. It's been with me as long as I can remember. Flashes of recognition for places I've never visited, details about people I've never met. She leaned against the porch railing. My mother called it a gift, my father, a scientific curiosity. I simply learned to live with it. And my cabin, how do you explain knowing it so intimately? Emma hesitated, seeming to choose her words carefully. The dreams about your cabin began when I was 16. They were more vivid than any others I'd had, so real I could feel the grain of the wooden table, smell the pine smoke from the fire. She looked up at him, her expression vulnerable, and there was a man. I never saw his face clearly, but I knew he built that cabin with his own hands, that he loved it, though he was often lonely there. Xavier's heart beat faster. You're saying you dreamed of my home years before I built it. I know how it sounds, Emma said softly. Impossible, insane, even, but when I stepped into your cabin during the blizzard, she shook her head in wonder. Everything was exactly as I'd seen it 100 times in my dreams. Right down to the way the 3rd floorboard from the door creaks when stepped on. Xavier stared at her, torn between disbelief and a strange, compelling certainty that she was telling the truth. He remembered how naturally she'd moved through his home, finding things without searching, the way she'd known about his books, the immediate sense of familiarity that had disturbed him so deeply. There's more, Emma continued, her voice barely above a whisper. In my dreams, I wasn't just visiting that cabin. I lived there, with him, the man whose face I could never quite see. Her eyes met his, filled with a mixture of fear and determination. I think that man was you, Xavier. The statement hung between them in the cold night air. By all rational thought, Xavier should have dismissed her as delusional. Yet standing there, looking into her eyes, he felt a recognition that defied explanation, as if some part of him had been waiting for her without knowing it. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Because you asked," she said simply, "and because I'm tired of carrying this alone. All my life I've had these inexplicable connections to places and people. My parents tried to understand, but even they thought it was just an overactive imagination." She took a step toward him. "But you've seen it firsthand. You know there's no way I could have known those things about your cabin." Xavier couldn't argue with that. No matter how he tried to explain away her knowledge, the facts remained unexplainable by any rational means. "What do you want from me, Emma?" he asked, his voice low. "Nothing you're not willing to give," she replied. "But I think we were meant to meet, Xavier. Whether by fate or providence or something we can't begin to understand, our paths were meant to cross." Before Xavier could respond, the porch door opened, and Judge Hayes stepped out, his expression grave. "There you are," he said, his gaze moving between them. "I'm afraid I have troubling news. Marshal Williams just received word that the Blackwell gang was spotted heading back towards Silver Creek. They're gathering a posse to intercept them before they reach town." Xavier straightened immediately. "How many men does the marshal have?" "Not enough," the judge replied grimly. "Most of the able-bodied men are at the social, but many are reluctant to join the posse. The Blackwell gang has a reputation for ruthlessness." "I'll join them," Xavier said without hesitation. Emma stepped forward. "Xavier, no, these men are killers." "All the more reason they need to be stopped before they reach town," Xavier replied, already moving toward the steps. "Judge, please make sure Emma stays here where it's safe." Hayes nodded solemnly. "Be careful, son, these aren't men who fight fair." Xavier hurried toward the marshal's office, his mind racing. The evening had taken a turn he couldn't have anticipated, from Emma's impossible revelations to the threat of violence descending on Silver Creek. Yet despite the danger ahead, Xavier felt more alive than he had in years. Something had awakened in him, a desire to protect not just himself but others, to be part of something larger than his own isolated existence. And beneath it all was the undeniable pull he felt toward Emma Hayes, a woman who claimed to have known his home in dreams years before he built it. A woman who, against all reason, felt familiar to him in ways he couldn't explain. As Xavier joined the gathering posse, he pushed these thoughts aside. The Blackwell gang was coming, and Silver Creek needed every man who could handle a gun. The mysteries of Emma Hayes would have to wait. The posse assembled quickly, 12 men including Xavier and Marshal Williams, a grizzled veteran of the frontier with a reputation for fairness and courage. They rode out of town as snow began to fall lightly, following the eastern trail where scouts had reported seeing the gang. "Caldwell, right," the marshal said as they rode side by side at the front of the group. "Judge Hayes told me how you helped his niece after the stagecoach accident. Good of you." Xavier nodded. "How many in the Blackwell gang?" "8 that we know of," Williams replied grimly. "Led by Frank Blackwell himself, mean as a rattlesnake and twice as deadly. They've hit 3 towns in the territory already. Silver Creek was supposed to be a quick raid, but my deputies and some townspeople put up enough resistance that they retreated." He spat into the snow. "Now they're coming back to finish what they started, I reckon." They rode in silence for a time, the only sounds the creak of saddle leather and the soft thud of hooves in the fresh snow. Xavier found his thoughts returning to Emma despite his efforts to focus on the task ahead. Her claims were fantastic, beyond rational belief, yet he couldn't dismiss them outright. Not after witnessing her uncanny knowledge of his cabin firsthand. The marshal raised his hand suddenly, signaling the posse to halt. In the distance, flickering lights could be seen through the falling snow, campfires, perhaps a mile ahead. "That'll be them," Williams said quietly. "They've made camp for the night, probably planning to hit town at dawn when folks are still sleeping." The marshal quickly divided the men into 3 groups. They would approach the camp from different directions, using the darkness and falling snow for cover. The plan was to surround the Blackwell gang and demand their surrender, though everyone understood that men like Frank Blackwell rarely surrendered. Xavier found himself in a group with 3 other men, approaching the camp from the north. They dismounted a quarter-mile away, securing their horses to trees before continuing on foot. The snow muffled their footsteps as they crept through the pines, guided by the distant glow of campfires. As they drew closer, voices became audible, rough laughter, the clink of bottles, boasts about what they'd do when they reached Silver Creek. Xavier's blood ran cold as he heard one man describe his plans for the fancy ladies at the social. The 4 men spread out as planned, taking positions behind trees and boulders that offered both cover and clear lines of sight to the camp. Xavier could now make out 8 men gathered around 2 campfires, passing bottles and cleaning weapons. He recognized the scarred leader he and Emma had encountered on the trail, Frank Blackwell himself, distinguishable by his height and the distinctive scar above his eye. Xavier checked his revolver, ensuring all 6 chambers were loaded. The marshal's plan was to wait for all groups to be in position, then signal with an owl call before demanding the gang's surrender. Minutes passed in tense silence as the other groups presumably took their positions. Xavier's breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he waited, his gaze fixed on Blackwell. This man and his gang had brought terror to peaceful settlements across the territory. They'd murdered his friends at the Double R Ranch. They threatened everything that hardworking people like those in Silver Creek were trying to build. For 2 years, Xavier had avoided involvement with others, believing isolation was the only way to prevent further loss. Now, crouched in the snow with a loaded revolver, he realized how futile that approach had been. Evil men like Blackwell would continue to prey on the innocent whether Xavier engaged with the world or not. The only question was whether good men would stand against them. The owl call finally came, 3 soft hoots that could have been mistaken for the real thing if Xavier hadn't been listening for it. A moment later, Marshal Williams' voice rang out from the southern edge of the camp. Frank Blackwell. "This is Marshal Williams of Silver Creek. You and your men are surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender peacefully." The reaction was immediate. The outlaws leapt to their feet, drawing guns and diving for cover. Blackwell himself upended a table, creating a barricade as he shouted orders to his men. "Williams, you old fool, there ain't enough men in Silver Creek with the guts to take us on." "I've got 12 armed men surrounding this camp," the marshal called back. "Surrender now and I guarantee you a fair trial. Resist and I can't promise any of you will see morning." Blackwell's response was a bullet fired in the marshal's direction. Within seconds, the night erupted in gunfire. Xavier took careful aim at an outlaw attempting to flank the marshal's position, squeezing the trigger with steady pressure. The man fell with a cry, clutching his shoulder. The battle was chaotic, muzzle flashes illuminating the snowy night, shouts and curses mingling with the sharp reports of revolvers and rifles. Xavier moved from tree to tree, offering supporting fire to the other posse members while trying to get a clear shot at Blackwell himself. He had just reloaded when a movement to his right caught his attention. One of the outlaws had circled behind the posse's position and was taking aim at an unsuspecting townsman. Xavier shouted a warning, drawing the outlaw's attention to himself instead. The man fired, the bullet splintering bark inches from Xavier's head. Xavier returned fire, his bullet finding its mark. The outlaw staggered but remained standing, raising his gun for another shot. Before he could fire, a second shot rang out from somewhere to Xavier's left, and the outlaw fell face first into the snow. Xavier turned to see Emma standing 20 yards away, the small derringer smoking in her hand. Their eyes met across the distance, hers wide with fear but determined. "Emma," Xavier's shock quickly turned to alarm. "What are you doing here?" Before she could answer, more gunfire erupted near the center of the camp. Xavier gestured urgently for Emma to take cover behind a large boulder, then moved to join her, keeping his body between her and the gunfight. "Have you lost your mind?" he demanded when they were both behind the relative safety of the rock. "You should be in town." "I couldn't let you face them alone," she said, reloading her derringer with steady hands despite the danger. I just knew something terrible would happen if I didn't come." "How did you even find us?" "I followed your tracks in the snow," she replied. Uncle Thomas was occupied helping organize the women and children in the town hall. He didn't notice me leave. Xavier wanted to be angry, but the determination in her eyes stopped him. "Stay behind this rock. Don't move unless I tell you to." He peered cautiously around the boulder, assessing the situation. The gunfight had shifted, several of Blackwell's men were down, but so were at least 2 of the posse. Marshal Williams was pinned behind a fallen tree, exchanging fire with Blackwell and two remaining gang members. "I'm going to help the marshal," Xavier told Emma. "Stay here." "Wait," she grabbed his arm, her eyes intense. "Blackwell has a second gun, a derringer in his left boot. Be careful." Xavier stared at her. "How could you possibly know that?" "I just do," she said simply. "Play Xavier. Be careful." Her certainty was unsettling, but Xavier had no time to question it further. He squeezed her hand once, then moved out from behind the boulder, using the trees for cover as he worked his way toward the marshal's position. The gunfire had become sporadic, both sides conserving ammunition as they searched for advantageous shots. Xavier managed to reach Williams without drawing fire, crouching beside the older man behind the fallen tree. "One of your posse members?" Williams asked, nodding toward the boulder where Emma remained hidden. "Not exactly," Xavier replied grimly. "Judge Hayes' niece followed us from town." The marshal swore under his breath. "Women. My wife's the same way, stubborn as a mule when she thinks I'm in danger." He checked his revolver, 2 bullets remaining. "Blackwell's holed up behind that overturned wagon with his 2 remaining men. They're pinned down, but they've got good cover." "We need to flank them," Xavier suggested. "I can circle around to the east if you can provide covering fire." Williams nodded. "On my signal. But be careful, Blackwell's crafty." Xavier remembered Emma's warning about the hidden derringer. He may have a concealed weapon, a derringer in his left boot. The marshal raised an eyebrow, but didn't question how Xavier knew this. "I'll keep that in mind, ready." Xavier nodded, tensing for the move. Williams fired 2 quick shots at the wagon, forcing the outlaws to duck. Xavier used the distraction to sprint toward a cluster of pines that would allow him to circle behind Blackwell's position. He had almost reached the trees when a shot rang out from an unexpected direction. Pain exploded in Xavier's left side as the bullet grazed his ribs, spinning him around and sending him sprawling into the snow. A 9th outlaw, one they hadn't accounted for, emerged from the shadows, rifle raised for a killing shot. 2 shots sounded almost simultaneously, one from Emma's position and one from farther away. The outlaw jerked, hit by both bullets, and collapsed. Xavier scrambled to his feet, pressing a hand against his bleeding side as he dove for cover behind a tree. The wound was painful but not deep. The bullet had only grazed him. He caught a glimpse of Emma, who had left her sheltered position to get a clear shot at his attacker. Their eyes met briefly across the distance before she ducked back behind the boulder. The exchange had drawn Blackwell's attention. The outlaw leader fired at Emma's position, his bullets chipping stone as she pressed herself flat against the ground behind the boulder. Rage surged through Xavier, cold and clarifying. In that moment, he understood that his 2 years of isolation had been a mistake, not because it failed to protect him from pain, but because it had denied him the chance to protect others, to be part of something worth fighting for. Ignoring the pain in his side, Xavier moved swiftly through the trees, circling behind the overturned wagon. One of Blackwell's men spotted him and raised his gun, but Xavier was faster. His bullet caught the outlaw in the chest, dropping him instantly. The second man turned, firing wildly in Xavier's direction. A bullet from Marshal Williams' gun ended the threat, leaving only Frank Blackwell himself. The outlaw leader realized his position was compromised. With a roar of defiance, he broke cover, firing his revolver at Williams while running toward the horses tethered at the edge of the camp. "He's getting away," someone shouted. Xavier stepped into Blackwell's path, his revolver aimed steadily at the outlaw's chest. "Drop it, Blackwell." The outlaw skidded to a halt, his scarred face twisted with fury. His revolver was empty. Xavier had counted the shots, but Emma's warning echoed in his mind, the derringer in his boot. "You're that cowboy from the trail," Blackwell snarled, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Should have killed you then." "Drop your gun and raise your hands," Xavier repeated, watching the outlaw's every movement. Blackwell let his empty revolver fall to the snow, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face. "You've got me, I suppose." He began to raise his hands, then suddenly dropped to one knee, reaching for his boot. Xavier fired before Blackwell could draw the concealed derringer. The outlaw fell backward into the snow, a look of surprise frozen on his face. The small derringer lay exposed beside his boot, confirming Emma's impossible knowledge. The gunfight was over. Of the 9 outlaws, 6 were dead, including Blackwell. The remaining 3 were wounded and quickly secured by the surviving posse members. The cost had been high. 3 townsmen lay dead in the snow, and 2 others, including Marshal Williams, were wounded. Xavier found Emma kneeling beside the marshal, pressing a makeshift bandage against a wound in the older man's shoulder. Her face was pale but composed as she worked, ignoring the chaos around her. "The bleeding's slowing," she told Williams. "But you'll need the doctor to remove the bullet." The marshal nodded weakly. "Thank you, miss, though I still think you should have stayed in town." Emma's eyes met Xavier's over the marshal's prone form. "If I had, more people would have died tonight." It was true, her warning about the hidden derringer, her timely shot at the 9th outlaw. Without her presence, the outcome might have been very different. Xavier touched his side where the bullet had grazed him, wincing at the sting. "You're hurt," Emma said, rising quickly to examine his wound. "It's just a graze," Xavier assured her, though he didn't pull away as her gentle fingers probed the injury. "It needs cleaning and bandaging," she insisted. "Sit down before you fall down." Xavier complied, too exhausted to argue. As Emma tended to his wound, the surviving posse members organized the removal of the dead and wounded. The 3 captured outlaws were bound and placed on horses for the return journey to Silver Creek, where they would face trial for their crimes. Dawn was breaking by the time they began the solemn procession back to town, the wounded supported by comrades, the dead draped over saddles, the prisoners under heavy guard. Emma rode double with Xavier, her arms wrapped around his waist, careful to avoid his injured side. "How did you know?" Xavier asked quietly as they rode. "About the derringer, about the 9th man." "How could you possibly have known?" Emma was silent for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the sound of the horses. "I've seen this night before," she said. "In dreams, over and over, different versions, different outcomes. But always the same choice, whether to follow you or stay behind." Her arms tightened slightly around his waist. "In some versions, I stayed in town as told. In those dreams, I attend your funeral 3 days later." Xavier felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter morning. "That's impossible," she finished for him. "I know, but it's the truth, Xavier. Whatever this gift or curse is that I have, it showed me this night in a dozen different ways. And in every version where I stayed behind, you died at Blackwell's hand." They rode in silence after that, Xavier's mind struggling to reconcile Emma's claims with his rational understanding of the world. Yet the evidence was undeniable. She had known things no one could have known. Her presence had saved his life and possibly others as well. By the time they reached Silver Creek, the town was in an uproar. News of the gunfight had reached them via a rider sent ahead with word of the dead and wounded. Families crowded the main street, scanning the returning posse for loved ones. Judge Hayes stood at the forefront, his face lined with worry until he spotted Emma riding with Xavier. The judge helped Emma down from the horse, embracing her briefly before examining her for injuries. "When I realized you were gone," he shook his head, unable to complete the thought. "I'm fine, Uncle Thomas," she assured him, "but Xavier needs the doctor. He was shot." "It's just a graze," Xavier protested again, though the wound throbbed painfully as he dismounted. Hayes studied him with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Dr. Simmons is at the clinic, tending to the first of the wounded. Let's get you there." As they made their way through town, people stopped to thank the returning posse members. News that Frank Blackwell was dead spread quickly, bringing both relief and sorrow for the cost of that victory. 3 families would bury fathers and husbands, 2 more would nurse wounded loved ones. Yet there was also pride in how the town had stood against evil. The Blackwell gang had terrorized the territory for too long. Their defeat marked a new chapter for Silver Creek and the surrounding settlements, one where law and community prevailed over lawlessness and fear. At the doctor's small clinic, Xavier waited patiently while the more seriously wounded were treated first. Emma stayed beside him, refusing her uncle's suggestion that she return home to rest. When the doctor finally examined Xavier's wound, he pronounced it minor but in need of cleaning to prevent infection. "You were lucky, Mr. Caldwell," Dr. Simmons said as he applied a clean bandage. "An inch to the right, and we'd be having a very different conversation." Xavier's eyes found Emma's across the room. "It wasn't luck, doctor. I had someone watching over me." Later, as dawn gave way to full morning, Xavier and Emma sat on the porch of Judge Hayes' home. The judge had gone to help organize care for the families of the fallen posse members, leaving them alone with cups of hot coffee and the weight of all that had happened. I should return to my cabin, Xavier said, though he made no move to leave. The animals need tending. Emma nodded, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup for warmth. Will you come back? The question held more meaning than the simple words suggested. Xavier turned to look at her, really look at her, in the clear morning light. Emma Hayes had upended his carefully constructed isolation in the span of a few days. She had challenged his beliefs about the world with her impossible knowledge. She had followed him into danger and saved his life, and through it all, she had looked at him with eyes that seemed to see beyond his carefully maintained barriers to the man he had once been, and perhaps could be again. Yes, he said simply. I'll come back. Emma's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I'll be here. As Xavier rode back to his cabin later that morning, he found himself viewing the familiar landscape through new eyes. The snow-covered hills, the stands of pine and aspen, the distant mountains, they were no longer merely the backdrop to his isolation, but the setting for a new chapter in his life. One that, against all odds and reason, might include Emma Hayes. His cabin, when he reached it, seemed both familiar and strange, as if in his absence it had transformed from a fortress against the world into merely a house awaiting a home. Xavier tended to his animals, cleaned his wounds, and finally allowed exhaustion to claim him, falling into a deep sleep in his bed that still held the faint scent of lavender. He dreamed of Emma, not as she was now, but as she might be, moving through his cabin with practiced ease, a gold band glinting on her finger as she reached for something on a high shelf. In the dream, he came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing a kiss to her neck. She leaned back against him, saying something he couldn't quite hear as the dream dissolved into wakefulness. Xavier stared at the ceiling of his cabin, the dream lingering like a promise. For 2 years, he had convinced himself that isolation was safety, that connections were vulnerabilities to be avoided at all costs. In the span of a few days, Emma Hayes had shattered that belief, showing him that true strength lay not in standing alone, but in finding someone worth standing beside. Whatever inexplicable force had drawn them together, whether fate, providence, or something beyond understanding, Xavier found he no longer needed to explain it. Some mysteries, as Judge Hayes had said, weren't meant to be solved, just experienced. The Christmas social was rescheduled for the following week, after the town had time to bury its dead and begin healing from the Blackwell gang's final raid. Xavier arrived early again, but this time not out of awkwardness. He wanted a moment with Emma before the festivities began. He found her helping to arrange pine boughs around the town hall, her green dress complemented by a red ribbon in her hair. When she saw him, her smile lit up her entire face. "You came back," she said simply. Xavier took her hand, leading her to a quiet corner away from the bustling preparations. "I have something to ask you." Emma's eyes widened slightly, but she waited patiently as Xavier gathered his thoughts. "You said you recognized my cabin because you'd seen it in dreams," he began. "That you knew every creaking floorboard, every book on my shelf, because in those dreams it was your home too." Emma nodded, her expression guarded. "Yes. In these dreams," Xavier continued, his heart beating faster, were we together as more than friends?" A blush colored Emma's cheeks, but she held his gaze steadily. "Yes, in my dreams the cabin was our home. We built a life there together." Xavier took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about what your uncle said, that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, just experienced. I don't understand how you could know things you've never seen, or how you could dream of a place I hadn't even built yet." He squeezed her hand gently. "But I do know that since you walked into my life, everything has changed. For the first time in 2 years, I'm not just surviving, I'm living." Emma's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Xavier, I'm not proposing marriage," he clarified quickly. "Not yet, that would be too fast, even for a man who's had his entire worldview upended in a week." This earned a small laugh from Emma. "But I am asking if you'd be willing to help me solve another mystery." "What mystery is that?" Xavier smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Whether the future you dreamed can actually come true. Whether two people who met under impossible circumstances can build something real together." Emma's answer was to rise on her tiptoes and press a soft kiss to his lips. "I think," she whispered as she pulled away, "that's a mystery worth solving together." The town hall filled with people as the social began. This time there was an undercurrent of somber gratitude beneath the celebrations. Gratitude for safety restored, for evil defeated, for community preserved. When Xavier and Emma took to the dance floor, there were knowing smiles and approving nods from the townspeople. Judge Hayes watched from the refreshment table, raising his cup in silent toast when Xavier caught his eye. As they waltzed among the other couples, Emma rested her head briefly against Xavier's chest. "Does it feel strange?" she asked. "Knowing that someone dreamed of you before meeting you." Xavier considered the question, then shook his head. "Not as strange as I would have expected, maybe because in some way I think I was dreaming of you too. Not in the same way, not with your gift, but these past 2 years living alone in that cabin, there was always an emptiness I couldn't name. Now I understand what it was." "What?" Emma asked, looking up at him. "The absence of you," Xavier said simply, as if the cabin knew it was waiting for something I hadn't yet found. Emma's smile was radiant, or someone who had already seen it in dreams. As they danced beneath the glow of Christmas candles, Xavier Caldwell realized that his understanding of the world had expanded to include mysteries he couldn't explain. And chief among them was how a woman he'd known for barely a week could feel so familiar, so essential to his existence. Perhaps some connections transcended ordinary understanding. Perhaps Emma's dreams were glimpses of a future meant to be, or perhaps they were simply two souls fortunate enough to find each other against incredible odds. Whatever the explanation, Xavier knew with absolute certainty that his days of isolation were over. The frontier was still dangerous, still unpredictable, but he no longer faced it alone, and his cabin, built as a fortress against connection, would become exactly what Emma had seen in her dreams. A home filled with the life they would build together. "What are you thinking?" Emma asked as the waltz ended. Xavier smiled, taking her hand and leading her toward the doors that opened to the starlit night. "I'm thinking that I need to fix that creaking floorboard before you move in permanently." Emma's laughter, bright and joyful, was the sweetest sound Xavier had ever heard, the sound of a future he never expected but now couldn't imagine living without.